May 1985. Steve Jobs is 30 years old. He is the co-founder of Apple Computer, the company he started in a garage 9 years earlier, the company that changed what a personal computer was, the company whose name is now synonymous with his. And the board of directors has just stripped him of all operational responsibility. Not fired. Not yet. Something worse, made irrelevant inside his own company. Given a corner office with no team, no product, no power. A title with nothing attached to it. The CEO he had personally recruited, John Scully, the man Jobs had lured from Pepsi with the line, "Do you want to sell sugared water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Had gone to the board and asked them to choose between himself and Jobs. They chose Scully. Jobs described what followed as the most devastating period of his life. He was publicly humiliated. He was written off by the industry he had helped create. The press, which had built him up as a visionary, now reported his removal with something that read a lot like satisfaction. He said later, "I had been rejected, but I was still in love." What he did in the 12 years that followed is one of the most extraordinary second acts in American business history. Not because of the products he built, though he built remarkable ones, but because of the specific way he decided to respond to one of the worst professional humiliations a person can experience. And here is what I want to explore with you today. When you look at what Steve Jobs did between 1985 and 1997, the decisions he made, the way he reframed what happened, the specific moves that turned Exile into Return, what you find is a set of responses that map almost exactly onto the Stoic framework. Not because Jobs read Marcus Aurelius. He may have. He was an eclectic reader and a student of Eastern philosophy, but that's not the point. The point is this. The Stoics built a framework for navigating exactly the kind of crisis that Jobs faced in 1985. And Jobs, whether consciously or not, applied that framework in ways that are instructive not just for understanding his story, but for understanding your own. This is Series 2 of The Examined Life. We take real people, real decisions, and we run them through the Stoic framework. Not to prove that famous people were secretly Stoics, but to show you what the ancient tools actually look like when they're working in the real world. Today, Steve Jobs, 3 decisions, 3 Stoic tools, and what they tell us about both the man and the philosophy. Let's go. Part 1. The story, what actually happened. 12 years that nobody talks about, and why they're the most important part of the story. To understand what Jobs did right, and the places where he failed badly, you need to understand what actually happened in those 12 years. Because the story most people know goes, Jobs got fired from Apple, then Jobs came back to Apple and saved it. That's not wrong, but it's missing the part that explains everything, the 12 years in between. When Jobs left Apple in September 1985, he eventually resigned rather than accept the token role the board had given him. He did 2 things that everyone around him thought were mistakes. He started a new computer company called Next, and he bought a small division of George Lucas's film studio for $5 million. The division made computer graphics for films and had about 40 employees. That division was Pixar. At the time, neither of these moves made obvious sense. Next was going to compete in the high-end workstation market, a segment dominated by established players, with hardware that turned out to be too expensive for most buyers. Pixar was not a film studio. It was a hardware and software company that made graphics workstations. Jobs thought he was buying a tech company. He did not know he was buying what would become the most successful animation studio in history. He would lose significant money on both investments before either paid off. Next's hardware division eventually shut down entirely. The company pivoted to selling its operating system, and that operating system, Next Step, would eventually become the foundation of Mac OS X. But that was years away. Pixar went through years of near bankruptcy, multiple rounds of layoffs, and a relationship with Jobs that was, by multiple accounts, often difficult. He came close to selling the company several times. And yet, in 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first feature-length computer-animated film in history. It was a phenomenon. It made over $361 million worldwide on a $30 million budget. It launched a franchise. It changed animation. Pixar's IPO, which happened the same week as Toy Story's release, made Jobs a billionaire for the first time in his life. He had never been a billionaire at Apple. Meanwhile, Apple was collapsing. The company had burned through 4 CEOs in the years since Jobs left. It was losing market share. Its products were unfocused. Its culture was fractured. In 1996, it was spending more money than it was making, and analysts were openly questioning whether it would survive. Apple acquired Next in December 1996, primarily for its operating system. Jobs came back as an advisor. By September 1997, he was interim CEO. By the end of 1998, he had launched the iMac. By 2001, the iPod. By 2007, the iPhone. You know the rest. Here is what most people miss about this story. The 12 years between 1985 and 1997 were not a detour. They were not the gap between chapters 1 and 2. They were the most important years of Jobs' development as a leader, as a product thinker, as a person who understood what he was doing and why. At Next, he learned how to build a company with craft and standards even when the market wasn't responding. He learned the limits of his own ego, expensively and painfully. At Pixar, he learned how to step back and let other people do their best work without controlling everything. He learned, slowly, with difficulty, what it meant to trust a team. He came back to Apple in 1997 a different person than the one who left in 1985. Not nicer, necessarily. People who worked with him in the second tenure have plenty of stories about his demanding nature. But wiser, more precise about what mattered, more willing to focus ruthlessly and let go of what didn't serve the vision. The Stoics have a word for this kind of transformation through adversity. They call it the obstacle becoming the way. And Jobs' 12 years is one of the best case studies in American history of what that actually looks like. One more thing before we get into the analysis, because it matters for how we read what follows. Jobs was not a saint. He was famously difficult to work with. He could be cruel in ways that went beyond honest feedback into genuine unkindness. He denied paternity of his first daughter for years. He parked in handicapped spaces. He was, by many accounts, a difficult father and a complicated friend. The Stoic analysis of his decisions is not an endorsement of his character overall. It is a surgical examination of specific choices in specific moments, where those choices reflect the Stoic framework working and where they reflect it failing. That honesty is the only kind worth having. Let's do the analysis. Part 2. 3 decisions, 3 Stoic tools. Decision 1. The choice not to fight. Dichotomy of Control, September 1985. The first decision is the one Jobs made in the immediate aftermath of being sidelined at Apple. And it is a decision that most people, including most people who knew Jobs well, did not expect him to make. He chose not to fight. Let me put that in context, because it's significant. Jobs had the money, the lawyers, and the public profile to wage an extended war against the Apple board. He could have gone to the press, and the press, hungry for drama, would have covered it extensively. He could have mounted a proxy fight. He could have made the next several years of Apple's life as difficult as possible. He didn't. He resigned. He sold his Apple shares, nearly all of them, keeping just one so he'd continue receiving the annual report. He walked away, and then he started building something new. From a Stoic perspective, this is the dichotomy of control working at a high level. Think about what was in the right column for Jobs in September 1985. The board's decision made, not his to unmake. The press's narrative, already written, not his to rewrite. Scully's position, secure for now, not his to dislodge. Apple's direction without him, not his to control. What was in the left column? What he built next? Where he put his energy? What he chose to create? The quality of his work going forward. Jobs, at 30 years old, which is a young age to make this kind of strategic clarity, chose to work in the left column. Not because he wasn't angry. He was furious. He described the period in almost physical terms, like a punch to the stomach, like having the ground disappear beneath him. But the anger, which was real and legitimate, did not direct his action. He felt it, and then he asked the Stoic question, though he wouldn't have used those words, of what was actually in his power. And the answer was, next, Pixar, the next thing. Now, here is where I want to be careful about the analysis, because there's a version of this story that makes it sound easier than it was. Jobs did not make this choice cleanly or immediately. In the months after leaving Apple, He went through what multiple people who knew him described as genuine grief, depression, loss of direction, a period of real darkness. He gave an interview in the months after leaving where he said things that sounded, to people around him, like a man who was genuinely shattered. The Stoic framework does not promise that recognizing what's in your control is fast or painless. Epictetus was clear: the practice is a practice. You come back to it. You lose it. You come back again. What Jobs eventually did, after the grief, not instead of it, was redirect. He looked at what remained in his left column and he started working in it. That is the dichotomy of control in its realistic form. Not instant equanimity, but eventual and deliberate redirection. And the specific thing he redirected toward is the second decision. One more note on this first decision, because it becomes relevant later. Jobs sold nearly all his Apple shares in 1985. This was widely seen as an act of spite or resignation, getting out completely. But look at what it actually did for him psychologically. By liquidating his Apple stake, he severed his financial connection to the right column, the things he couldn't control. He was no longer watching Apple's stock price as a proxy for his self-worth. He was no longer emotionally invested in the fate of something he couldn't influence. He moved the money to the left column, his new ventures. This is not a financial lesson. It's a psychological one. The Stoics were very clear that attachment to things in the right column is the primary source of suffering. Not caring about them, but being attached to them in a way that ties your well-being to their outcome. Jobs detached from Apple financially, and that detachment freed him to build without the distortion of bitterness at a company he could no longer influence. That is Stoic financial hygiene applied to one of the highest stakes situations imaginable. Decision 2. What he built it next. Amor Fati, the 12 years as raw material. The second decision is actually a series of decisions made across 12 years. And the Stoic tool it reflects is Amor Fati, the love of fate. Or more precisely, the refusal to treat circumstances as obstacles and the insistence on treating them as raw material. Next was, by the market standards, a commercial failure. The hardware was too expensive. The target market, educational institutions, largely didn't buy it. The company burned through money at a rate that alarmed everyone around Jobs. But here is what Jobs did with that failure. He used it. The next operating system, next step, was built on a foundation called Unix, with an object-oriented development environment that was, genuinely and technically, years ahead of what Apple or Microsoft were offering. Tim Berners-Lee wrote the world's first web browser on a Next computer. Doom, the game that defined first-person shooters, was developed on Next workstations. John Lasseter, the director of Toy Story, used Next computers in the early days of Pixar's development work. The hardware failed, but the software and the approach to building software, that survived. That became the foundation of what Apple would buy when it acquired Next in 1996. Jobs did not get lucky with Next. He built something real, in the conditions he had, with the resources available to him, even when the market wasn't responding. He didn't wait for better circumstances. He treated the circumstances he had as the ones he was working with. Marcus Aurelius writes, "A blazing fire makes flame and brightness out of everything that is thrown into it." That sentence describes what Jobs did with the material of his exile. The rejection from Apple, fuel. The years without a consumer market responding to his work, fuel. The financial pressure, the failed hardware, the near misses. All of it became material for building something that eventually came back and saved the company that had rejected him. But I want to be specific about what Amor Fati is and is not here, because there's a version of this analysis that gets lazy. Amor Fati is not. Everything worked out, so the exile was good. That reading is backward-looking and easy. It's the equivalent of saying everything happens for a reason while pointing at an outcome. Amor Fati is a forward-looking practice. It asks, given that this is the situation, what do I do with it? Jobs asked that question in 1985, in 1987, in 1991 when Next still hadn't broken through, in 1994 when he was still arguing with the Pixar team about whether to make feature films. Every year, in conditions that were uncertain and often discouraging, the question was the same. What does this situation demand? What can I build with what I have? That repeated act of redirecting toward creation rather than dwelling in what had been lost. That is Amor Fati practiced over 12 years. Not as a feeling, as a discipline. And here is the part of the next story that most people don't know, and that I think is the most Stoic part of all. In the mid-1990s, Jobs made the decision to shut down Next's hardware division entirely. He had spent a decade building those machines. He believed in them. They represented enormous investment, financial and personal. And he killed them because they weren't working, because the market had made its assessment, because continuing to pour resources into a product no one was buying was not discipline. It was attachment masquerading as persistence. The Stoics made a distinction between persistence in service of a genuine goal and stubbornness in service of ego. Marcus Aurelius writes about the ability to abandon a course of action without shame when evidence shows it isn't working, not as defeat, but as wisdom. Jobs shutting down Next Hardware was this kind of wisdom. He wasn't attached to the product. He was attached to the work. The work survived. The product didn't have to. That distinction between attachment to a specific vehicle and commitment to the underlying purpose is one of the most practically Stoic things Jobs ever did. Decision 3. How he came back to Apple. Premeditatio Malorum, the strategy of the return. The third decision is the one that determined whether the second act was going to work. When Jobs returned to Apple in September 1997 as interim CEO, a title he kept for almost 3 years, partly out of genuine uncertainty about whether he wanted the full commitment, he faced a situation that was, objectively, dire. Apple had a product line of dozens of computers across confusing categories. It was spending more than it was making. Its most loyal customers were wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake investing in the platform. Jobs' first major public act was a keynote at Macworld in 1997 that surprised everyone, including Apple employees who expected him to come in swinging against the establishment that had pushed him out. Instead, he announced a partnership with Microsoft. Bill Gates appeared on screen by satellite, which got a mixed reaction from the audience. Apple and Microsoft would collaborate on key software. Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple. The audience booed. Jobs waited for it. Then he said, clearly and without defensiveness, "We have to let go of the notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose." That sentence, in that room, in that moment, was a Stoic act. Here's why. The Stoic tool at work in this decision is Premeditatio Malorum, the premeditation of what could go wrong, the preparation of the mind for difficult realities, the ability to act from a place of clear-eyed assessment rather than emotional reaction. Jobs, in the 12 years of his exile, had watched Apple deteriorate. He had watched the company he built struggle against a Microsoft operating system that ran on cheaper hardware and had won the market by volume. He could have come back angry. He could have come back with the founder's narrative. They pushed me out, and now I'm going to do things my way. Instead, he came back with a prepared mind. He knew what Apple's actual situation was. He had assessed it clearly, and he had concluded, accurately, that Apple's survival required stability, focus, and a partner that could validate it to the market. Microsoft was that partner. This was not a sentimental decision. Jobs and Gates were not friends in any warm sense. Jobs was often scathing about Microsoft's design standards. He believed, genuinely, that Apple made better products. But believing you make better products and refusing a partnership that could save your company because of wounded pride, that is ego operating, not wisdom. The Stoics called this kind of clarity the ability to act on what the situation demands rather than what your emotions want. Logos. Reason over reaction. Reality over narrative. Jobs chose logos. And then he did the most brutally Stoic thing of his second tenure. He cut Apple's product line by 70%. Not gradually. Immediately. Within weeks of taking full control, he reduced Apple's entire product lineup to 4 products: 2 desktop computers and 2 laptops. 1 for consumers, 1 for professionals, in each category. That's it. A company that had dozens of products was now making 4. The people whose products got cut were devastated. Teams were laid off. Projects that people had spent years on were canceled overnight. Jobs was not sentimental about any of it. He had done the Stoic preparation. He had assessed what was actually serving Apple's mission and what was serving inertia, habit, or the comfort of having options. And he had concluded that focus, brutal, unapologetic focus, was what the situation demanded. Not what was comfortable, what the situation demanded. Premeditatio Malorum, applied to an organizational turnaround, means doing the hard assessment before the crisis forces your hand. Jobs had done that assessment. He had prepared his mind, during those 12 years, during the return, during the first months of brutal clarity about Apple's situation, for the hard decisions. So that when the moment came, he wasn't deciding in real time. He was executing a plan built from clear eyes. Part 3, where Jobs failed the Stoic framework. The honest part, and why it makes the whole analysis more useful. I told you at the beginning of this video that we weren't going to pretend Jobs was a saint, and I want to keep that promise, because the honest assessment of where he failed Stoic principles is actually more instructive than the places where he succeeded, because these are the failures that most of us are actually at risk of. Failure 1, the treatment of his daughter Lisa. In 1978, Jobs denied paternity of his daughter Lisa Brennan, a child he'd had with his college girlfriend Kristen Brennan. He denied it under oath. He claimed, absurdly, that he was sterile. While Kristen received welfare payments, Jobs was becoming a millionaire. He eventually acknowledged Lisa. He named a computer after her, the Apple Lisa, though he denied that was what the name meant. He had a complicated and painful relationship with her throughout her childhood. From a Stoic perspective, this is a complete failure of what the Stoics called justice, one of the 4 cardinal virtues. Not justice in the abstract. Justice as in, giving people what they are owed by your actions. Lisa was owed acknowledgement, support, presence. Jobs had the means to provide all 3 and initially chose not to. No framework retrofits that into wisdom. It was wrong. He knew it was wrong, and he did it anyway. The Stoics would not have been confused about this. They would have called it exactly what it was, a failure of virtue in the most foundational category. Failure 2. The reality distortion field as manipulation. Jobs was famous for what people around him called his reality distortion field, his ability to convince people that impossible things were possible, that deadlines could be moved, that products could be redesigned in weeks instead of months. Sometimes this produced extraordinary results. It pushed teams past what they thought their limits were. But sometimes, often, it was manipulation. People who worked for Jobs described being told things that weren't true about timelines, about competitive situations, about the state of products. They described being credit denied publicly for work they'd done. They describe a culture where proximity to Jobs' approval was a form of currency that he dispensed and withheld strategically. Epictetus is unambiguous about honesty. The commitment to speaking what is true is not negotiable in the Stoic framework. It is one of the things most fully in your control, and therefore one of the things you are most responsible for. Jobs' reality distortion, at its worst, was a form of lying that he justified by the outcomes it produced. The Stoics would not accept that justification. Good outcomes achieved through manipulation are not Stoic. They are pragmatic at best, and they exact costs to the people manipulated, to the culture built on that manipulation, and eventually to the person doing it. Jobs' interpersonal legacy is complicated partly because of this. People who worked for him describe being simultaneously grateful for what he pushed them to achieve and damaged by how he went about it. That damage is real. The Stoic framework names it clearly. Why include this in the analysis? Because the point of this series is not to find famous people who were perfect Stoics. The point is to use real people and real decisions as a laboratory for understanding what the framework actually asks of us, and what it costs when we get it wrong. Jobs' failures are instructive because they are failures most of us are capable of in smaller ways. The temptation to avoid responsibility for harm we've caused. The temptation to use our effectiveness as a justification for how we treat people. These are not exotic failures. They are available to all of us. The Stoic framework is not a guarantee against them. It is a set of commitments to honesty, to justice, to treating people as ends rather than means, that have to be chosen repeatedly, including when choosing them is costly. Jobs chose well in some of the most dramatic professional circumstances imaginable. He did not always choose well in the quieter, more personal moments. That tension is not a disqualification from being useful as a case study. It is what makes him human, and what makes the case study real. Part 4. What we take home. 3 things from Jobs' 12 years that work in your life. 3 things. These come directly from the Stoic analysis of Jobs' decisions, not as things that worked for a tech billionaire, but as principles that are available to anyone navigating the aftermath of something that didn't go the way they planned. First, the quality of your next move matters more than the size of your loss. Jobs lost Apple. The scale of that loss, in public humiliation, in identity disruption, in the practical reality of being pushed out of the thing he'd built, was enormous. What made the difference was not the loss. It was what he chose to build next. The quality of attention he brought to the work at Next and Pixar, even when neither of them was working the way he hoped. The Dichotomy of Control says, the loss is in the right column. What you build next is in the left. Most of us spend more time in our heads with the loss than we spend with the next move. Jobs, eventually, after grief, after darkness, after a period of genuine disorientation, put his energy in the left column. Not because he was superhuman, because he asked the right question: what can I actually build from here? Second, exile is education if you let it be. The 12 years Jobs spent outside Apple changed what he was capable of in ways that could not have happened inside Apple. At Next, he learned the cost of his own blind spots. The hardware failure was not random. It reflected decisions he made about pricing, about the target market, about what he thought customers wanted versus what they would actually buy. He learned expensively. At Pixar, he learned to step back. He was not a filmmaker. He was not an animator. He could not control the creative product the way he could control Apple hardware. Learning to trust, and eventually to genuinely celebrate. What John Lasseter and the Pixar team built without his direction was a development he could not have made at Apple, where he controlled everything. The Stoics called this pathei mathos, learning through suffering. Not suffering as punishment, suffering as a particular kind of teacher, the one who shows you what you could not see when things were going well. Ask yourself, what is the situation you are currently in showing you that you couldn't have seen from a more comfortable position? That question is the beginning of using your exile the way Jobs used his. Third, prepare your mind before the crisis, not during it. The Jobs who came back to Apple in 1997 was ready for what he found. Not because Apple's situation wasn't bad, it was, but because he had spent 12 years doing the hard assessment of what Apple was, of what he was, of what a focused technology company could be. When he cut 70% of Apple's product line, he wasn't deciding in real time. He was executing a clarity he had already built. The Stoic practice of Premeditatio Malorum is exactly this: preparation in advance of the crisis, so that when the hard moment comes, you are not making decisions from a place of shock and reaction. You are executing from a place of prepared clarity. Most of us wait until we're in the crisis to start thinking clearly about it. The Stoics built a practice specifically to reverse that order. Jobs' 12 years were, among other things, 12 years of preparation. Not wasted time, not a detour, a long, expensive, occasionally painful preparation for the clarity of the return. Yours might not take 12 years, but the preparation, the hard, honest assessment of your situation, done in advance of when you need to act on it, that's always available. Start there. There is a line from Jobs' 2005 Stanford commencement address that I think most people know, and that most people slightly misunderstand. He said, "You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future." This line is usually read as an argument for faith, for trusting the universe to work things out. I think it's actually an argument for something more stoic than that. He's saying, you cannot know, in the middle of the exile, what the exile is building. You cannot see, from inside the 12 years, that Next's operating system will become Mac OS X. You cannot see that Pixar will become the most successful animation studio in history. You cannot see that the rejection from Apple was the thing that made the return to Apple possible. You cannot see it looking forward. What you can do is build well in the circumstances you're in. Do the next thing with integrity. Do it with full attention. Do it in the left column, in the domain of what is actually yours to influence. And trust. not passively, but through the active discipline of doing your best work in conditions you didn't choose, that the dots will eventually connect. That is Amor Fati, not loving what happened, loving, fully, actively, with everything you have, the work that the circumstances are demanding from you right now. Jobs figured that out somewhere in the 12 years. The framework has been available for 2,000 years. What are you building with yours? 3 decisions. 3 Stoic tools. The dichotomy of control. Jobs chose not to fight the right column and redirected entirely to the left. What are you spending energy on that is not yours to control? Amor Fati. Jobs treated 12 years of exile as raw material and built something real from it. What does your current situation demand that you build? Premeditatio Malorum. Jobs came back with a prepared mind and executed from clarity, not shock. What hard assessment are you avoiding because the moment isn't urgent yet? The next video in the Examine Life is going to do something completely different. We're looking at Oprah Winfrey and the specific moment in 1989 that almost ended her career. What she did in the year that followed is one of the most complete examples of Amor Fati in modern American life that I've ever found. If you want to be there for that one, subscribe. Leave a comment. Which of the 3 decisions from Jobs' story is most relevant to something you're navigating right now? The dichotomy of control, the Amor Fati of exile, or the premeditatio of the prepared mind? I'll read every one, and your answers genuinely shape what this series becomes. I'll see you in the next one.